Flutter offers some very powerful yet simple animation APIs that we can use to delight our users. So in this two-part tutorial, we will explore these APIs in detail by building a page flip widget that we can use to change between night and day in this interactive demo. To do this, we will use AnimationController, AnimationBuilder, gesture detectors, and custom 3D matrix transforms. The result will be a custom page flip builder that hides away all the complexity behind an easy-to-use API. And at the end, I will also share a new Flutter package that you can use to flip pages, cards, and widgets of any size. And to make your life easier, I have prepared a written tutorial that explains all the steps one by one and includes a lot of illustrations and diagrams. Not only that, but I also included a preview of the final result running inside a Flutter web application so that you can play directly with this on my website. And I think this is pretty cool, right? Okay, so let's get started with a couple of announcements. First of all, this tutorial assumes that you're already familiar with the basics of animations with Flutter. If you're new to this topic, then you should check the Introduction to Animations page on the Flutter website. Also, we will build the page flip widget entirely from scratch, and I have prepared a starter project that you can download from the link in the description below. So I encourage you to go ahead and download this now. And once you have done this, you can open the project in VS Code and head over to the pubspec.yaml file. And as you can see, I have set a minimum Dart version of 2.12.0, which means that we will be running with null safety enabled. Also, the starter project already comes with some assets in SVG format, and we will use the Flutter SVG library to load them into the app. So as a next step, we can install all the dependencies and also run the application. And if everything goes correctly, you will see this page appearing on the simulator. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have on the main file. And as you can see, we are using this light home page as the home of our material app. And we also have a dark home page that we could use instead. And both these pages contain an onFlip callback that fires when we press on this button. So our goal is to create a page flip builder widget that can flip between the two pages when this button is pressed. And in the next video, we will also implement an interactive page flip that we can control with gestures. So a good place to start is to decide what API our page flip widget should have. So we could replace this dark home page with a page flip builder widget that we will create later. And to make our page flip builder reusable, then the front and back widgets should be given as arguments. So we might be tempted to write an API that looks like this. But since only one page will be visible on screen at any given time, then it's more performant to use two widget builder arguments and let page flip builder call the correct one. In other words, we could replace this with a front builder and this with a back builder. And once again, we haven't created this API yet, and all we are doing here is trying to decide how we may want to call this. So what about the onFlip callback of our pages? We should use this callback to call some kind of flip method inside the page flip builder. As we will see, the page flip builder will be a stateful widget, so we could declare a final page flip key to be a global key of type page flip builder state, like this. And then we could pass this as a key to our page flip builder. And finally, we could use it to access the current state and call a flip method that we will define later on. And we can do the same thing over here. Of course, none of this code compiles at this stage because we haven't created our page flip builder just yet. And we will do that next. But as a top tip, I recommend to think up front about what API you want your widgets to have. This will save you time later on and leads to widgets that are easier to use. So as a next step, we can create a new file called pageflipbuilder.dart. And inside it, we can add a new stateful widget, which we can call pageflipbuilder. And we need to remember to import material.dart. And because we want this state subclass to be public, then we can rename it and remove this underscore. And then we need to add the two widget builders. So here we can declare a final widget builder front builder and a final widget builder back builder. And we can also generate a constructor for these fields. And since we are using null safety, we want these arguments to be required like this. Then we can move this constructor to the top, and we can also format our code like this. Then we can move over to the build method, and because we don't have any animation code just yet, then here we can just return widget.frontBuilder with context, like this. And the other thing that we want to do is to add a new flip method, which will be empty for now. And this is what we will call from the main file. And the reason we are able to call this is that we have made this state class public. So I can add a comment about this. And now that we have this, we can head back to our main.dart file, and here we can import our page flip builder, and we can see that this is now a valid identifier, and we also need to make sure that we are calling these callbacks correctly, for example, using this syntax. And if we save now and hot restart, we can see that now the light home page appears, because this is what is returned by the build method inside the page flip builder. So the public API for the page flip builder is now ready, and it's time to work out how to animate things. And to get the animation working, we need two ingredients: an animation controller that we can use to control the flip transition, and an AnimatedBuilder widget that we will use to rotate the front and back page with a custom 3D transform based on the animation value. And as we will see, we can get the effect we want by passing the animation controller as an input to the AnimatedBuilder. So our next two goals are to set up an animation controller to control the flip transition, and to write some custom code using AnimatedBuilder to get the rotation effect. So let's see how to do this, starting with the animation controller code. So let me get back to our example, and at this stage we need to do two things. The first is to set up an animation controller, and the second one is to add a boolean state variable that will tell us which page we should show. So let's do this. And because we will add an animation controller, we need to add a single ticker provider state mixing to our state class. And then we can declare a boolean show front side variable and initialize it to true by default. And we can also declare a late final animation controller, like this. And then we can override the init state method. And inside here, we can initialize our animation controller, and we need to pass the vsync variable, and also we can set a duration of 500 milliseconds. And the main idea here is that inside the flip method, we can check if show front side is true, and in that case, we can call controller.forward, otherwise we can call controller.reverse. And we will use this to make our page flip in one direction or the other. But we also need to make sure that we toggle our state variable when the animation completes. And to do that, we can add a status listener to our controller. So over here, we can type controller.addStatusListener with an argument called updateStatus. And over here, we can add a void updateStatus method, which takes an animation status as an argument. And then we can say if status is equal to animation status.completed or status is equal to animation status.dismissed, then we can call set state, and then inside it we want to toggle the value of our show front side variable. And before we continue, we also need to remember to override the dispose method. So we can do this and remove this to do. And here we can type controller.removeStatusListener with update status, and also controller.dispose. So this makes sure that everything is cleaned up properly when the widget is removed. So if we want, we can hot restart, and we can see that our app still looks the same. But we can check that our code works correctly by adding a listener that prints the value of our animation controller's value inside init state. So here we can add a to-do, and then we can type controller.addListener, and then inside it we can print the value, and we can use string interpolation to print controller.value, like this. And at this stage we should be able to open our debug console. Then we can hot restart the application, and now if we press this button, we can see that all the values from 0 all the way to 1 are printed. And if we press this again, we can see that the numbers go back from 1 all the way to 0. So this confirms that our animation controller is doing the right thing, and we can use it to drive the page flip animation. So we can remove the temporary code, and then we can carry on. So our next step is to add the page flip rotation code, and earlier on we said that we will use an AnimatedBuilder to get the effect we want. So while we could return an animated builder inside our build method, we should follow the single responsibility principle and create a separate widget instead. So let's do this. Over here, we can create a new stateless widget, and we're going to call this animated page flip builder. And then we're going to add some variables. The first one will be an animation of type double, and we can call this animation. And then we are also going to add our show front side boolean variable along with the front and the back widget builders. Then we can generate a constructor for all these variables. And here we are also going to format the code like this. And we also want to make sure that all these variables are required because they are non-nullable. And now that we have this, we can update the build method of the parent widget. So over here, we can remove this line and instead we can return an animated page flip builder. And then we can pass our controller for the animation argument along with all the remaining arguments like this. Then we can scroll down and here we need to implement the build method of this class. So here we can replace this container with an animated builder, and this takes an animation argument and also a builder argument. And this gives us a context and an optional child argument, and we need to return a widget inside here in order to get the effect that we want. So we will write this code in a minute, but before that, let's work out some maths. So with our current setup, our animation always has a value between 0 and 1, and this corresponds to a rotation value, which should be between 0 and pi. And to get the effect that we want, we had to show the front page for animation values between 0 and 0.5, and we should show the back page for animation values between 0.5 and 1. So let's write some code to implement this logic. We will start by creating a final is animation first half variable, which will be equal to animation.value. And we can take the absolute value of this, and we will see later why this is useful. And then we're going to say less than 0.5. Then we're going to add a final child variable equal to is animation first half, and then we will use the ternary operator to return front builder or back builder depending on the value of this variable. Then we'll declare a final rotation value equal to animation.value times pi, and we can import dart.math so that this identifier is valid. And then we need to calculate the correct rotation angle depending on which page we need to show. And the right formula for doing this is going to be animation.value greater than 0.5. And again, we will use the ternary operator. And if this is true, we will return pi minus rotation value. And otherwise, we will return rotation value. And finally, we need to apply the rotation that we want. To do this, we can return a transform widget, which will take a transform argument, and to this we will pass matrix4.rotation_y with rotation angle as an argument. Then we can pass the child that we have computed over here, and we can also pass an alignment property of alignment.center. And now we are ready to check if this works. So we can hot reload, and now we can press this button and we can see that the page flips. So this is good progress, but this transform lacks in depth and doesn't really look like a 3D rotation. To fix that, we need to calculate and apply a tilt value. So let me add some code to enable this and show you that it works, and then I'll explain the maths behind it. So here we can declare a var tilt variable, which is equal to animation.value minus 0.5, and then we'll take the absolute value of this and subtract 0.5. And then we are going to multiply this value by is animation first half, and we'll use the ternary operator to return minus 0.003 if this is true, and 0.003 otherwise. And finally, we need to modify this transform matrix. So the way we can do this is to use the cascade operator, and then we can call set entry, and then we will set row 3, column 0, and tilt as a value. So let's hot reload once again, and this time when we flip the page, we can see that the effect is a lot more convincing. But what about the maths? Well, the resulting matrix 4 that we have used for our transform looks like this. And if you want to learn more about matrix 4 and perspective transforms, I can recommend this article by the Flutter community. Or if you're just happy with the result, then that's fine too, and you can pat yourself on the back. So this completes part 1 of this tutorial, and along the way we have learned how to pass an animation controller as an input to an AnimatedBuilder widget and use the AnimatedBuilder and transform widgets to apply 3D rotations. And while Page Flip Builder is quite complex on the inside, we have designed an API that makes it easy to use from the outside. And in the next video we will make our Page Flip Builder interactive by adding a gesture detector, so stay tuned for part 2. Or if you can't wait and want to use this already in your apps, you can head over to pub.dev, where I have published the final product as a Flutter package. And of course, you can also check out the source code on GitHub. And in addition to what we have covered in this tutorial, the Page Flip Builder package offers some extra features. In fact, you can use it to flip widgets of any size, and you can also flip around the horizontal or vertical axis. So if you want to check out this package, you can find all the relevant links in the description below. And I hope that this video has given you a taste for what it's like to work with animations in Flutter. So thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for part 2 of this tutorial, where we will learn how to make this transition interactive.